My name is John Avila. I'm here on behalf of U.S. Taiwan Watch. We are currently in Project 2049 Institute, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Ian Easton, distinguished author of two books, his latest, which is The Final Struggle Inside China's Global Strategy. Mr. Easton, thank you very much for your time.
John, thanks for coming.
I would first like to go ahead and open up with your book. Who is your intended audience of the book, and what do you hope that once they read through it, they will go ahead and get?
Well, I mean, ideally, I would love for people in every democracy, every liberal democracy in the world to have access to it. But I wrote it primarily for Americans. I'm trying to tell the story of what the Chinese Communist Party's vision for the future is and what that means for all the rest of us.
What do you believe that their vision of the future is?
It's a very dark vision. That's not where I started out in the research, but the more I read, the more I learned, the more clear it became that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party elite believe that they have a superior model of governance, that one-party communist dictatorships are best, and that other countries should emulate their system. And so they're in the process now of exporting that abroad. And if they're successful, ultimately democracies, liberal democracies like the United States or like Taiwan, will no longer exist at some point in the future.
Who do you believe is currently in the greatest danger, immediate danger, from the CCP?
Well, I mean, that's obvious, isn't it? I mean, Taiwan is the most vulnerable democratic country on the planet right now. There's no other democracy that is being targeted the way Taiwan is. Taiwan really is on the front lines.
And you say that they're on the front lines. China's military operations, but beyond their borders, their claims over the Taiwan Strait, that it's part of their territorial waters, where does this figure into their overall strategy?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party has a global strategy. They are building military bases around the world. They are going global. They have a base in Argentina, a military space base. They have a naval base in Djibouti in Africa. And they're building bases. Right now, they're looking to gain access to ports and air bases and potential bases for their Marines around the world. They're particularly interested in choke points, maritime choke points like the Panama Canal. But this is a global military strategy. They see themselves as in a contest with the United States and with other liberal democracies, and this is something that they intend to win. It matters a great deal for countries like Taiwan, and one of the reasons I said Taiwan is on the front lines is because that's the first step, or that's the next step. After they have cracked down on Hong Kong and turned Hong Kong into just another PRC city, Taiwan is the next step. But that's not where they intend to stop. So they claim all of Taiwan's territory. They claim that Taiwan is not a country, that it doesn't exist. And of course, that's a false narrative. Taiwan is a sovereign, independent country, and it has been since 1949. Taiwan's never been part of the People's Republic of China. But this is their narrative. In the same way that Russia, they have a narrative that Ukraine is that they have a rightful claim to Ukraine and that they should control Ukraine. China has the exact same narrative when it comes to Taiwan.
And we'll go ahead and speak about, I believe, what you brought up, which is a very important point about Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan parallels. Could you go briefly into what the U.S. policy is regarding Taiwan, strategic ambiguity, potentially?
The United States government has a very troubled policy when it comes to Taiwan. It's troubled because Taiwan exists as a free, independent, sovereign, democratic country, but it is not treated as such by the United States. And in fact, we've not had diplomatic relations with Taiwan since 1979. Prior to 1979, Taiwan was a treaty ally. We had tens of thousands of troops stationed in Taiwan. We had a mutual defense treaty, actually had nuclear weapons deployed to Taiwan to defend Taiwan against the possibility of a Chinese Communist Party invasion in the 1950s, but all the way through to the 1970s. But unfortunately, the PRC has this zero-sum policy. It's a zero-sum game that they play. That governments can either recognize Beijing as the one true China, or they can recognize Taiwan, the Republic of China, ROC, as the one true China. And so over time, most governments now recognize the PRC, and that requires them to actively deny that Taiwan is a country. And so that's where we are today. Fortunately, we still have the Taiwan Relations Act. and we have President Reagan's 6 assurances to Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act has 2 key provisions in it. Both are security related. One is that the United States government, as a matter of policy, will maintain the capacity to respond to any use of force or coercion against Taiwan. So not just an invasion, but also a potential blockade or even extreme forms of economic warfare. That the U.S. government, as a matter of policy, as a matter of law, in fact, because this is U.S. law, domestic law, that we and our military has to maintain the ability to defend Taiwan. Doesn't guarantee that we will.
You anticipated my question, Mr. Easton.
And this is where strategic ambiguity comes in. But the second provision of the Taiwan Relations Act, we will provide Taiwan with defensive arms and services. In other words, arms sales. That will provide Taiwan with the weapons that the Taiwanese military needs to maintain a credible self-defense.
And in your opinion, do you believe that the history of arms sales and the current crop of arms sales would provide a credible deterrent or defensive capability to Taiwan in the event of Chinese aggression?
No, I do not.
If we may return to the strategic ambiguity, it seems as if you are support or in support of strategic clarity or a clarification of what the U.S. policy would be in terms of defense. Would that be?
Well, I think any policy that is based on a myth is going to get us into trouble. Right now, our policy towards the People's Republic of China and our policy towards Taiwan is based on myth. It's the myth that there's only one China in the world and that there's not 2 separate countries, 2 separate governments, when in fact it's obvious there are 2 countries in the world that have China in their name. There's the People's Republic of China and there's the Republic of China. One of those countries is a communist one-party dictatorship, very, very deeply authoritarian, in fact to the point where it's totalitarian. It's like something out of an Orwellian nightmare. The other is a thriving democracy that in fact is ranked among the world's top 10 leading democracies. And it's America's, this year I believe, it's our 8th largest trading partner, in addition to all that. And it's a key node in the telecommunications ecosystem. And so it's ironic when you think about it, that every day we extend legitimacy to our strategic rival, to this dictatorship in Beijing, and we actively deny legitimacy to Taiwan's Republic of China's government. That we treat China like it's not a legitimate country, when of course it is. And so I think strategic clarity begins with the facts. It's counterproductive, in my opinion, for the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government to deny that Taiwan does exist as a country. I think that's very counterproductive. That makes all of the military and defense and security issues so much more difficult, because every time the Pentagon comes to the National Security Council or the White House and says, we need to do X, Y, or Z to fulfill our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act. In order for our war plans or defense of Taiwan plans to work, we need to be able to do X, Y, or Z. And time again, they're told, no, you cannot do that because that will go against our one China policy. And so you can see how this would get us into some trouble. Taiwan, the idea of strategic ambiguity is we're not going to commit to the defense of Taiwan. The U.S. government, as a matter of policy, will not commit. We've committed to the defense of Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, and of course all of our NATO allies. There's about 50 countries around the world that have an ironclad security commitment from the United States. And along with that commitment, because it's not just a piece of paper, comes a lot of real world tangible exercises that go on, military deployments that go on, a whole range of activities go on between our government and the governments of our allies, our treaty allies. Those are not going on today with Taiwan. Taiwan is isolated, and that is very, very destabilizing. Strategic ambiguity, the idea that we don't know if we'll defend Taiwan, but we might. And recently we've heard President Biden say we will intervene on Taiwan's behalf militarily. And he said it 3 times now. You know, for all we know, by the time this interview is over, he'll have said it a 4th or a 5th time, right? But each time he says that, then his staff will walk it back. And so we're still in this ambiguous position where we don't know. And because we don't know if we'll defend Taiwan or not, and by we, I mean the United States of America, because we don't know, that makes planning very difficult. That makes being prepared for it very difficult. And it greatly increases the risk that in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, there will be very devastating and tragic friendly fire on both sides, because our militaries are not coordinating with each other. They don't train together. They don't know each other at all. And in fact, President Biden has now had 5 very long telephone conversations or digital summits with Chairman Xi Jinping in Beijing. He has not once called President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan. Not once. Not a phone call. Not an email. Not a text message. So that means that our leaders are not talking to each other. That greatly increases the risk of miscalculation.
Some on the other side, though, Mr. Easton, would say that switching to strategic clarity also carries some risks, specifically that it would reduce Taiwanese efforts to improve their own defensive capabilities. Some of the allies, perchance those that are closer to China, would not support the change to strategic clarity, resulting in the loss of some allies. Also, that it may confirm in Beijing's mind that the U.S. is actively seeking U.S. independence. How do you reply to those points?
I think from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, Taiwan does not exist. Taiwan doesn't have an independent government. But of course, the reality is that Taiwan does exist. The Republic of China government does exist. Taiwan does enjoy popular sovereignty. It exists. It's a real country. I've been there. I know. I've lived in China. I've lived in Taiwan. These are separate countries. And so the idea that by improving our diplomatic relations with Taiwan, that would somehow be inherently provocative to Beijing, that says much more about the troubled nature of the Chinese Communist Party's own legitimacy, or perhaps its lack of legitimacy, because the Chinese people don't get a vote. This is a one-party dictatorship. And so I think from the United States perspective, from this American's perspective, we should not be basing our foreign policy on the insecurities of our strategic rival. Mm-hmm. We should be basing our foreign policy on what is in our own national security interests, both our pragmatic interests and our principled interests as a believer in freedom and democracy. Regarding what those interests are and where they align with Taiwan, I think we have a great interest in supporting liberal democracies, like-minded countries like Taiwan. I do believe we are in a war of ideas with the Chinese Communist Party. I think strategic competition between the U.S. and the PRC is not just about who has more ships in their navy or who has more missiles. It's about a lot more than that. And it's not just about tariffs and economic warfare and trade disputes either. At the end of the day, this is about what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where individuals are empowered to decide for themselves what their future will look like, where people and countries can be represented and have a voice? Or do we want to live in a world where people don't have a voice and individuals don't matter? Individuals just become an instrument for the glory of the state.
And let me go ahead and interrupt you, Mr. Easton. So you had said there's some strategic differences between the United States and the PRC, the CCP. In your book, there is a wonderful chart about what you believe are the strategic pros and cons of each system. Could you go ahead and go into some detail regarding what you believe may be the strategic strengths of the United States, as well as that of the PRC, and how we could counter those strategic strengths of the PRC?
Yeah, so a big part of the book is looking at strategic competition between the U.S. and the PRC. And part of that involves, how do we judge the state of play? What are the metrics that we use? How do we measure who's winning and who's losing, and who might be winning 5 years from now or 10 years into the future? How do you judge that? I mean, these are big, unstructured, very squishy analytical problems. And so if you start with first principles, the United States has a great advantage because we have a much higher standard of living. We have a humanistic ideology, and the United States does have an ideology. I mean, read our Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. We're a very experimental kind of country. Before the United States came along, the entire history of humanity was a history of strongman rule that manifested itself in the form of emperors and kings, queens, and tyrants and dictators of all stripes, right? But ultimately it came down to people were instruments to be used by their governments or their regimes or their empires, right? The United States is very different. Since 1776, we have tried this experiment in empowering individuals legally. And so individuals don't have to do what the government tells them to do. And in fact, the whole purpose of the government is to serve the people and to provide for their security and for their well-being, and to ensure that they have all of their basic freedoms, and that protects their human rights. So I think that's a great advantage that the United States has, is the quality of life, the quality of the ideology, the fact that we have rule of law on our side, and of course that we do still have a more powerful military and economy, and we have an edge when it comes to education and technology. So these are all areas where the United States still maintains significant strategic advantages. But I think the warning message that I try to issue in this book is we are now on a trajectory where the PRC is catching up. And in some areas, they've already surpassed us. And if we continue on the road that we're on currently, we could go into a very dark future.
And so what, as an American society specifically, should we be looking at, developing, strategizing for to maintain that edge, and in the aspects where we have lost that edge, regain the advantage?
Well, I think one of the areas that's very important is in international organizations. So the United States benefited greatly from the United Nations and the United Nations system in the wake of World War II. Because the lesson of World War II is you never want to have to fight another great power war. You never want World War III. And part of that is defanging totalitarian dictatorships. You never want to have another Nazi Germany or fascist Empire of Japan or fascist Italy. You don't want to have to face off against an organization like Comintern, Communist International, which Vladimir Lenin established in 1919. And the Soviet Union, from that point forward, was pushing this idea of international communism around the world. The United Nations system was built to protect the world from the spread of authoritarianism. Ultimately, that was the vision that the founders had. But over time, unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party has been able to gain access at the highest levels, including at leadership levels. And so now they're subverting the United Nations from within. And so one of the ideas that I propose in the book is that the United States can work together in a more formal fashion with other like-minded democracies to establish new international governance organizations that are exclusive. In other words, all countries are welcome, but only if they meet certain high standards for good governance, only if they're free and open and liberal democracies. Because if you welcome in your enemies into your own camp, then they can corrupt you from within. And of course, we've seen that happen at the United Nations. Another lesson, I think, from the research is that we will not be successful over the long run if we continue to invest our own money as a country and our own managerial know-how and our own technology into the success of our strategic rivals. Because right now, that's what we're doing.
Specifically on that point, manufacturing, I think we've seen leave the United States, leaving us at a deficit. We are increasingly reliant on manufacturing of sophisticated items from China. Do you think that this would create a disadvantage in the event of Chinese aggression?
Absolutely do.
How would you correct that or propose a roadmap? What would the roadmap look like?
Well, I think we absolutely have to think through what we need to be able to manufacture here in the United States. The reason the United States became a superpower in the first place is because we were an industrial power. And we were not just an industrial power, but we were a superpower. That's one of the reasons we won World War II, is because we were the arsenal of democracy. For every one airplane the Germans could build, we could build 10. For every one aircraft carrier the Empire of Japan could build, we could build 10 or 100 by 1945. Once our entire country was mobilized and all of our factories were working 24/7. It was incredible what U.S. industry could accomplish. We're now in a position where our country's been de-industrialized, and we need to correct that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to bring back all industry to the United States. Probably would not make good economic sense, but it does mean that we need to be able to identify key industries So, for example, maybe pharmaceuticals, medical products, personal protection equipment. We saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic. Key industries that are strategic, that matter a great deal to the health and well-being of Americans, that we absolutely cannot outsource that. And we certainly cannot outsource that to countries that are not trustworthy, which is why it's so problematic that today we rely on the People's Republic of China for so much of our medical goods and so much of our electronics, so our computers, for example, and all the things that provide for connectivity, which is really the engine of the 21st century, certainly the economic engine of our times. A lot of that has been outsourced to China. I think we need to bring that back. And where that's not competitive in the United States, we can look to other countries in the Western Hemisphere.
You spoke about connectivity, computers. Taiwan is the preeminent factory of semiconductors in the world. Would you say that that is in the interest, or one of the interests of the United States, to maintain a free and independent Taiwan, to preserve the supply chain of those semiconductors, so we can go ahead and supply our military, our complex electrical goods, free of any interference or concern that the CCP may have a stranglehold on those?
I would say in peacetime, yes. But the problem is that Taiwan faces a very real threat of Chinese Communist Party attack. And that could start at any time. Nobody can predict with any accuracy or any precision at all when the Chinese Communist Party might launch overwhelming military attack against Taiwan. In the event that that should happen, the United States would be cut off. So would other countries around the world. China right now is investing massive national resources in the semiconductor manufacturing capability, so that even in the event of a war, they will be able to continue their military industrial buildup. We do not have that ability here in the United States. We need to build it. I don't think it's in the U.S. interest to rely on Taiwan for our chips. I think it's in our interest to make sure that we can provide for our own chips, that we can make advanced semiconductors here in the United States. There are many other reasons for us to defend Taiwan that are far more important, to my mind, than just the fact that we rely on Taiwan for semiconductors.
Your first book dealt with, in wonderful detail, what an attack by China on Taiwan would look like. Between the publication of that book and the publication of this most recent book, what new developments, what new principles do you believe that Taiwan, the people of Taiwan, the military of Taiwan, do each of those groups have to do to ensure that their security is provided for, it can be maintained, and in the event of an attack, defended successfully?
I think the key for the defense of Taiwan is a very strong U.S.-Taiwan relationship. That there's no way a country like Taiwan, in isolation, a country of 23 million people, that does not have nuclear weapons, that does not have an offensive military, has a military that's in fact constrained by the fact that it is a peaceful democracy. So you're not going to see a massive military industrial complex in Taiwan the way you see it in China. There's no way a country like that is going to be able to defend itself in the long run against the People's Republic of China, because China is a dictatorship that controls 1.4 billion people. It's the world's second largest economy. By some measures, in some categories, for example, we talked about industry and industrial, sheer industrial production capability, China's already at it. And of course, China has nuclear weapons, and it has very rapidly growing its nuclear stockpile. And so in terms of deterrence, I don't know what Taiwan's theory of deterrence is, other than make Taiwan as painful as possible to conquer. But at the end of the day, it would not make rational sense to expect Taiwan to defend itself in the long run against China. In the same way that we would not expect Japan, which is a much larger country. Japan has a population of 130 million people. We would not expect Japan to be able to defend itself against China, or South Korea for that matter, or even Germany or England. This is why we have an alliance system. And this is why I think ultimately we should be moving towards a NATO for Asia. We should have that model because collective security works, and it works very well. When we cooperate together, especially when like-minded democracies cooperate together, we're all greater than the sum of our parts. When we're isolated from each other, when we don't talk to each other, when we don't cooperate and collaborate and work together, when we don't have collective security, it's much easier for an authoritarian, revanchist country like China to pick off countries one by one. If you read the history of what happened in Europe in the 1930s, that's exactly what the Nazis did to their neighbors. If you look at what the Empire of Japan did in the late 1930s to their neighbors, it was the exact same formula. We learned from that during the Cold War, but I think we have to learn those lessons again.
I guess this goes back to your concept of, in your book, your concert of democracies. The development of a defense network, of a trade network. We've seen in the last few years a revitalization of the Quad, of trade networks in the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan is not a part of these networks. How would the inclusion of Taiwan assist in strengthening these networks?
Oh, it would matter a great deal. That we would be far more resilient if we included Taiwan. And Taiwan would be far safer if it was included. Again, when you're isolated, you're vulnerable. When you're together with friends and allies, then you're much, much stronger.
And the takeaway message that I believe we want to go ahead and leave our audience with is these struggles may seem gargantuan, beyond the influence of ordinary citizens. How can we, for example, I picked up this book and I read it. It created feelings within me that I wanted to go ahead and do something about. How could I, as an ordinary citizen, contribute to the success of Taiwan's continued freedom, independence, and growing democracy, and ensure that the United States has a wonderful, working, and growing, burgeoning relationship? How do I go ahead and ensure that?
You know, there's so many things that we can all do. One is we can educate ourselves on the threat, and then we can make sure that we are not investing our own money in the success of the People's Republic of China. Because today, if you buy a Lenovo computer or an IBM ThinkPad, you are investing your money into a company controlled by China's government. That's helping the PLA. If you use Huawei or ZTE or a Xiaomi device, for example, you're investing your money in the success of Beijing, of the Chinese Communist Party. If you have a small business, or maybe you're a large business owner, or you sit on a corporate board, if you're investing in China, then you are helping the Chinese Communist Party. You're undermining democracy. If you are at a technology company and you are working on contracts that's helping Chinese mega companies like Baidu or Alibaba or Tencent, then you're helping the Chinese Communist Party. You're helping in the spread of authoritarianism around the world. So that's part of it, is making sure that that we all as individuals don't provide our own money or our own capital for investors, our own technology, our own talent to our adversaries, right? Another part of it is to make sure that we're not surrendering our data, because data is a very powerful and important thing. So if you use TikTok, for example, you should probably think twice about that, because TikTok is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Ultimately, it's controlled by China's internal police services, intelligence services, and more likely than not, it's contributing to the Chinese military's goals. If you use other apps that are developed in Zhongguancun, in Beijing, in the Silicon Valley of the PRC, you should probably think twice about that. So a lot of it comes down to decisions that we all make. How we behave on social media. Do you choose to share Chinese propaganda? Or do you choose to support and like and follow the Taiwanese government, for example, or other NGOs that are supporting freedom and democracy? Do you support Uyghurs? Do you support Hong Kong, people who are advocating for freedom for Hong Kong? Do you support the Dalai Lama? You know, things of that nature. I think it all adds up, and there's so much that we can all do.
Well, Mr. Easton, I would like to thank you very much for your time. This was a wonderful book. I encourage all who are concerned about China and the growing threat to go ahead and pick up this book. Mr. Easton, thank you very much for your time.
John, my pleasure. Thank you.